Hello everyone and welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca. I'm part of the public programs team at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on country this evening. I live and work on Gadigal land and take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present and especially emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online this evening. Welcome to another fantastic instalment of the B-List Book Club online. I'm going to hand over to Bree very shortly, but before I do, I just wanted to give a quick promotion to the next instalment of the B-List Book Club. In an exciting return to normality, the next B-List with Lec Blaine will be held as both an on-site and online simultaneous event. You can register for both ticket types now on the State Library website. Bree speaks with exceptional writer Lec Blaine about his stunning debut car crash, a memoir, an account of grief, perseverance and courage on Wednesday, the 31st of March. That's it for me for the moment. I will now hand over to Bree with a quick reminder for all of you at home that we are using the Q&A function this evening. I encourage you all to submit any questions through to Bree, who will moderate these at the end of the talk. And now I'd love to welcome Bree to your screen.
Good evening. Thank you so much.
Not a problem. Thank you, Bree.
Thank you. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for once again deciding to spend your Thursday night here in my lounge room and in your lounge room. I would also like to acknowledge that where I am is Gadigal land. And when I say that, I mean that I also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and there's still been no treaty. And I personally support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It feels really, really good to be able to do an acknowledgement of country before we begin an event that is about interrogating colonization. And something I've learnt from listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and reading their works is that it's important not to talk about colonization as though it's in the past. It is something that is an ongoing process. The harm continues. So we are here with a special international edition of the B-List Book Club. I have been very excited to get to speak to this author about this particular book for quite some time now. We're going to be hearing from Alice Proctor talking about her incredible book, The Whole Picture, the colonial story of the art in our museums and why we need to talk about it. Alice Proctor is an historian of material culture and the creator of Uncomfortable Art Tours. She curates exhibitions, organizes events, makes podcasts, and writes things under the umbrella of The Exhibitionist. Proctor studied at the University College London, and her academic work concentrates on the intersections of post-colonial art practice and colonial material culture, settler storytelling, the concept of whiteness in the 18th and 19th centuries, the curation of historical trauma, and myths of national identity. She has appeared on BBC Radio 4's Front Row, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Statesman, AlJazeera.com, and The Times. She is an Australian, but grew up in Hong Kong and London. Alice, are you there? From the wee hours of the morning in London.
Good morning. Hello.
Hello. You have a coffee and I have a wine. Thank you for joining us. For everyone watching at home, obviously Alice and I will be in conversation for quite a while tonight, and I'm going to leave proper 10 to 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. Don't forget that you can type those in at any time to the Q&A box during this evening, and then I will filter them through to Alice at the end. Before you and I start chatting though, Alice, we are going to hear from you a little bit. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to start by explaining some of the kind of context in which I became interested in representing colonial history in museums. The beginning of this for me was really seeing a very strange exhibition when I was about 16. I'd already been interested in the relationship between Australian history and particularly the way that that's told in the UK, which is where I am. But I saw a display at the Natural History Museum, of all places, of some of the first portraits and watercolors by artists of the First Fleet. And so these are really amazing images that are created in the 1780s, 1790s by some of the first European artists to sort of live in what's now Australia. And amongst them, there's obviously a lot of images of nature, kind of flora and fauna specimens, but there are also a number of portraits of the Indigenous people, the Yora people of what's now around Sydney, that these artists were sort of living and interacting with. And this exhibition was just sort of in a little corridor at the Natural History Museum. It didn't get much press, it didn't get much attention, but it was really remarkable to see these images on display, particularly because directly opposite them was an installation by the Indigenous artist Daniel Boyd, whose work deals with kind of memories of colonialism to this really interesting extent. And he was an artist in residence at the museum at the time. And during his time working with these collections, he discovered that the remains of one of his ancestors were still being held by the museum. And so in this corridor, there was this sort of dialogue between these European artists trying to represent something that was kind of strange and new and unfamiliar to them, and Boyd as a modern person looking back on that history and finding his own kind of ancestry within that. And it was a beautiful display and a really interesting thing. But for me, the thing that stood out most was that there was this exhibition of portraits in a natural history museum. And it was the first time I'd really seen any kind of museum display that was even beginning to be aware of its own history in that sense. And it started me thinking about how these collections are created, how these objects move over time, and the sort of threads between the people making these objects and the people now displaying them. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but it was a particularly interesting experience for me as a little teenager who was trying to work out sort of how I dealt with my own family history as a white Australian person who was born there, but has mostly lived in kind of the motherland of the UK, if you want. And so I spent a lot of time sort of trying to work out how I felt about that. And it led me to thinking about how these kind of stories are created in Britain in the imagination of these writers and artists before they even came to what's now Australia. And so they have all this expectation and anticipation for what they're going to find. And I wanted to mention that because I think it's a really interesting example of how contemporary artists have the ability to kind of speak back to these collections. Boyd's work was really beautiful in doing that, but also because a number of these First Fleet collection objects are at the State Library. And so if you're aware of them or you want to go and look for them, it's possible to find them there. And yeah, I wanted to mention that mostly as a way of kind of drawing it back to the hosts of today's event and give some context to sort of where I started thinking about these things.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a bit about your, I suppose, your professional sort of educational background, but what I really want to hear about is how you came to the idea and started doing uncomfortable art tours. And for somebody who totally hasn't heard of you or what they are, I guess like what you feel like is the point of those, what you're like trying to get across by even running them.
Yeah, so the uncomfortable art tours are unauthorized guided tours of national collections here in the UK. I started them because I studied art history, and even in the course that was specifically about the art of the British Empire, I felt like we never really dealt with what was here. There was always this very strong sense, at least in the way that these subjects are taught in the UK, that sort of colonialism happened somewhere else. And I wanted to kind of bring that history home to people who live in Britain. And this comes back to that Natural History Museum exhibition as well, you know, trying to help people understand that these ideas, these kind of concepts, these political choices and these acts of violence have their roots here in Britain, and then they are exported. You know, colonialism doesn't just happen overseas, it's very much invented here in London. And so I would take people around these different collections and show them paintings or objects that related to that history. I started out working in art galleries for the most part. So I was looking at portraits and paintings of individuals that had some connection to Britain's colonial history. And we'd talk about that as a way of understanding these images and kind of use the object to get into a conversation that can often be quite intimidating and quite difficult if you've never thought about that before. So we'll talk about the way that a portrait can tell us about these people who were maybe involved in the transatlantic slave trade or led British colonial forces in India and across South Asia, for example. I also work in kind of more traditional museum collections where we'll think about how objects come to be here, how we see them kind of taken and transformed by museum collections. So objects with contested ownership, objects that are stolen or violently acquired, as a way of understanding how museums now displaying those pieces are kind of complicit in continuing that colonial history.
Kind of.
Kind of. Yeah, okay. And so with all of this, it was a way of kind of trying to introduce people to the idea that maybe, I say this because I was primarily speaking to a British audience who hadn't encountered this in school or university or anything like that. It was about trying to show people that they did actually have a connection to colonialism, which most of the audiences on my tours were not initially aware of, or probably not sort of conscious of to a greater extent. They might know that it was sort of a vague thing.
Let's talk about this. Something I really wanted to ask you was how interconnected these issues of curriculum at both a primary and secondary school level, and then also, you mentioned that you could go through your entire art history degree and not hear these interrogative ideas. I want to talk about this. I know it's big, but talk about how curriculums relate to institutions.
So the degree that I did, the art history degree that I did in the 5-ish years since I've graduated, has been completely rethought. And now they've got several lecturers that specifically teach on histories of colonialism. But that is within the last 5 years. That was not there when I was doing this undergrad degree. And so there's been a big change, even very recently. I was in high school in 2007, which marked the 200 years since the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, not the end of slavery in Britain's colonies, but the end of the triangle trade. At that point, we had the sort of compulsory bicentennial celebrations kind of thing that focused overwhelmingly on the abolitionists. We never talked about the kind of creation of transatlantic slavery. We never talked about sort of who was involved in this, what they were doing, the fact that, to abolish something, you have to begin it in the first place. There's a history there that we just never addressed. We only got the sort of positive Wilberforce and the abolitionists doing a great job, and then the British Navy becoming the kind of the police of the Atlantic and preventing other people from trading in enslaved lives. And that was it. And I had this sense that maybe there's more to this, but it was just not something that we sort of saw or covered or engaged with. When you do get that in schools in the UK, at least, it tends to be on a field trip. And so museums are often the places that end up sort of outsourced to do this kind of teaching, but they'll frequently do it in a very simplistic way. You'll have an hour or two with a bunch of school kids to try and give them a complete narrative. And I say this as someone who used to be an educational guide for school groups. It's very, very hard to engage with kids in a meaningful way. And so this is changing. There are incredible projects here, like the Black Curriculum, which is all about reframing the representation of Black and African people within the sort of British education system, within the national curricula and stuff. But there's no obligation for schools to engage with that. And it's something that's still woefully underrepresented in academic institutions in this country. And so, museums have a responsibility to do some of this. They're also very underfunded and under a huge amount of pressure, but it's not surprising to me that a large amount of the response that I've had to my book has come from students saying, we're not doing this at university and I wanted to know more. And so I've read your book as a way of kind of a 101 introduction to this. Because I can't do the whole history of the British Empire, but I can give people a place to start and hopefully some footnotes that'll help them find something else.
And you mentioned to me just before we went live that that some universities are starting to put your book on the recommended reading list for their students.
But which is hilarious to me.
But if you weren't even being taught about any of this even 5 years ago, and now a book that you've written interrogating that is being recommended to students, that's pretty quick turnaround in the context of
No, it definitely is. And I think that says a lot about the kind of current popular discussion around colonial history. There's this real issue at the moment, particularly in the UK, about what we do with statues and memorials to people involved in
It's happening here too.
And that's happening, I know that's happening for you too. Yeah. And so that's kind of become a bit of a flashpoint. Like everyone's sort of like, oh God, we have to talk about this stuff because everyone wants an opinion on the statues. And therefore that's been a sort of way into schools and universities and museums as well, dealing with this. But like, the sort of change that we see in curricula and in curation is something that happens generationally. You know, it's something that happens very, very slowly. And the shift within art history departments to dealing with colonial history is a very, very recent one. But if you go back 10, 15 years, you can see the same kind of gradual process happening with queer theory, and before that with gender theory and kind of feminist art histories. And this is something that happens very slowly, but art history as a kind of discipline is, it takes a lot of time to move, but when it does move, it moves in a really interesting way.
Something you mentioned in the introduction was that it's these sort of issues of conservatism, whatever, are compounded by the fact that like a position of a gallerist or a curator is such a hard position for anyone who's not already born into wealth and privilege to get. Like, talk about how the industry side of things, like who even gets those jobs, who can do unpaid internships, like all of that sort of more pragmatic infrastructure affects then what actually is on the wall and how a national identity is understood.
So, I mean, personally, I'm able to get away with running unauthorized guided tours in museums because I'm a nice white girl with an art history degree, and the gallery guides and security guides look at me and assume I'm regular staff because I have been regular staff. And so I know sort of what to do to pass in those institutions.
You're a double agent.
I am, yeah, I can Trojan horse it. And it's really important to be able to kind of use that privilege and use that ability to bring these stories into these institutions. And this is something that kind of art history as a sector, as an industry, the museum sort of culture sector rather, has a whole issue with, because these institutions, you know, like any kind of well-established institution, people tend to hire their replicas. And so in terms of trustee boards and things like that, things move very, very slowly in an incredibly painful way. Art history as a discipline is still not unfairly treated as a bit of a kind of puff subject. I think in a lot of places, people tend to assume it's going to be looking at pretty pictures and talking about what it is that just makes them so pretty. And that's not far off what a lot of art history departments do. There's a reason that a lot of
shots fired.
There's a reason that a lot of the work around museums is coming from anthropology departments or history or sort of social sciences rather than art history, because there's still this very strong divide between, you know, do we talk about the beautiful paintings and the biographies of the people that made them, or do we talk about the material culture that's being produced that includes things like domestic art, ephemeral objects, you know, not high art? There's this real strong divide still. And it means that there's this tendency to sort of assume that art history is going to be kind of fluffy and gentle, and plenty of people aren't interested in changing that. It's a subject that's not taught at many high schools. It's something that's almost exclusively taught at private schools, and therefore the people that study it at university tend to come from that background. You know, that's me. Like, I'm talking about myself here. I studied art history at high school because I was at a private school that enabled me to do that. And going into an art history degree, I had a kind of advantage because I was already familiar with the discipline. This is something that the consequence of it is that, you know, in the UK, at least, the art history and museum sort of industries are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly female, and overwhelmingly kind of people with kind of financial privilege and in many cases inherited wealth, because the industry is set up to assume that you're going to have to volunteer for years before you get a paid job. And like, it's very exploitative in that sense. You know, I started doing the tours because I couldn't get a paid job. And I figured that people were going to pay me for my expertise if I took them around a gallery. It was a way of making money in the museum industry when I didn't have any other options.
Okay, I want to talk about the book itself now. For people who haven't yet read it, can you explain this structure and how it's in the 4 separate parts: palace, classroom, memorial, playground? I'm interested in hearing about as well where the idea for that structure came in time when you were thinking about writing a book like this.
Yeah, so my first idea was to sort of talk about institutions in this very sweeping and general way, and to sort of write something very self-indulgent and abstract. And fortunately, I have a wonderful agent who reminded me that that was a bad idea. And from there, we started talking about the way that museums kind of fall into these categories, and the sort of big conversations that I wanted to have about these different types of museums mapped very nicely onto different types of galleries, different types of objects. I realized very early on in the process that I wanted to use real things, including stuff that I talk about on the tours, but also objects that it's not possible to discuss on the tours, either because they're not on display, they're exhibitions that are no longer in situ, that sort of thing. So the first thing I did was draw this really messy, really bad kind of mock-up of a gallery plan, and was sort of doodling the idea of like, can I take people on a tour through a museum? And so I drew this unbelievably shitty plan, but sort of labeled all the rooms with these different types of things. So I think it was originally like the treasure box instead of the palace. It was things like the classroom was there from the beginning, but it was the crypt rather than the memorial. The playground, I wanted to talk about the idea of the factory and the artist studio. I wanted to talk about sculpture parks. And so I drew this little like fake museum, and I was going to have a couple of objects from each type. And that was there really from the beginning, and then was refined into a structure that hopefully makes sense. But I wanted to show people the way that museums are not sort of static and unchanging things. The different types of collections have been more popular or less popular at different periods of time. And so beginning with the palace is all about starting with private collectors. The classroom is the sort of Victorian didactic model, the idea that you go to an institution to be improved. The crypt or the memorial was about the idea that these can be sites of grief and sites of trauma. And the playground was all about contemporary artists responding to all of the things that we'd already talked about in the earlier sections.
Okay, let's go to the palace first. I love how the way you structured it with these, putting them into sort of different categories. And it made me think about so many different art galleries and museums that I've been so lucky to go to around the world, and like what categories I thought in retrospect they fit into. And something that I really wanted to ask you about specifically about this palace sort of category, is to hear about how palace category museums and galleries, how important it is that they started as private places, and how important it is that we ask questions about what they were for when they were private, but then how that relates to what they are for even now that they're publicly open.
Yeah, so I think the thing about the palace is that it's it's a useful place to start chronologically, but it's also a useful place to start in terms of getting people used to the idea that museums are created by people. They don't sort of organically appear, right? All of these collections are mirrors of their founders. And, whenever I talk about this and I'm trying to sort of make it clear to people, this exercise I've done with school kids a few times is to ask them to think about what would be in the kind of museum of their life, and think about the objects that they would have as a way of representing themselves, and compare that to what anyone else would pick to describe them, right? So like the objects that you would choose to sort of encapsulate everything about you are very different to what someone else would pick to describe and sum you up. And that's what these palace museums do, is that they're reflections of these individual collectors who have a huge amount of power and disposable wealth, and they decide to create these little treasure boxes for their friends to visit, for people that they know to look at.
Sorry to interrupt. I just think it might help people who've not read the book yet. Can you give a couple of examples of,
Yeah, so the kind of archetypal palace museum is really the Louvre. And it's this space that is literally a palace from the beginning. And so it's full of the collections of the French royal family, and it is used as a way for people to kind of define themselves and reflect themselves. My favorite palace museum is the John Soane Museum, which is one of the palaces that's talked about in the book, because it's the private home of this architect, Soane, who builds a weird little private labyrinth in the basement of his house to hold all of his favorite objects. And it's arranged according to this completely idiosyncratic logic. It makes no sense to anyone else, but his students are allowed to wander through it and get a sort of insight into his mind. And that's an institution that still exists today. It's basically unchanged. And the idea is that you can go there and you can connect to him through his collection. But the objects that he has on display would be completely different if they were in a different museum. You know, he is telling his personal story through the things that he has on show, but they're objects from all over the world. And it creates this very weird, very idiosyncratic kind of experience. And I love it. It's one of my favorite museums.
I want to talk about a specific work now, which really grabbed my attention. When I bought this book, I read the blurb and then bought this book. But then when I sort of took it home and I went straight to the middle, where for anyone who hasn't ever seen a hard copy, it's one of the books where it has the sort of normal pages, and then in the middle it has print, like gloss pages with images on it. Sorry, rambling. But what really struck me was this picture. It's a reproduction of a painting called, is it a painting or a mural? You'll explain.
It's a painting, yeah.
The East offering its riches to Britannia. And I would love for you to basically go through the symbolism of some of the elements in this picture, and then how that relates to the socio-political context in which it was created. Because when I saw it without having read the book yet, what just struck me was the absurdity that the East was offering its riches to Britannia with cherubs in the corner, and what a just blatant rewriting of history that was.
Completely. So the East offering its riches to Britannia is a painting that was created for the ceiling of a meeting room in the offices of the East India Company. So it's corporate art from the beginning, like it's office decoration. But it's this oval painting that would have been on the ceiling. So when you were sitting around the table discussing the sort of financial the financial quarter or whatever, you could look up and see this image. And the East India Company is a corporation that is given a monopoly in India. So the British Crown decides that it is the only company that is allowed to trade in South Asia. Obviously, they don't consult anyone else over this, but consequently, the East India Company grows to become one of the most influential, most powerful forces in British imperialism. It is able to raise its own armies, set its own taxes, kind of fight wars, build cities, do whatever it wants. And it's given this royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I in the 1600s and exists virtually unchallenged until the 1850s, when Queen Victoria sort of absorbs it into the British government and makes it the British Empire in India. So this painting is commissioned for their meeting room, showing allegories of India and some of the other kind of countries with which the company traded, offering the bounty of their wealth to a figure of Britannia. Originally, the painting was supposed to show these countries offering their wealth to representatives of the East India Company, and they decided to make it slightly more subtle by making it about them giving their riches to Britain as a nation. But it shows this allegorical figure of Britannia receiving a basket of jewels from a woman who is described as representing India. They receive bundles of tea, of cotton, of silks, of medicine, all sorts of different things. It's a little hard to see in the reproduction because there's a lot of kind of detail that gets lost, but the idea is that it's these colonial or colonized and subjugated peoples voluntarily giving their wealth to the British. So not only is it this very blatant piece of propaganda, it's a blatant piece of propaganda that was designed for the officers of the people doing the subjugating. So you see with this painting very clearly the way that the East India Company, these other kind of colonial forces are writing their own history as it happens, and they're sort of inventing and reinventing the narrative to suit their political ambitions. And this painting is now on display in the Foreign Office, which is
so
weird.
ironic. I don't know. Weird, ironic, kind of messed up.
It's really, really weird. There is a bunch of very racist art in the Foreign Office. There are some famous murals of sort of national stereotypes that are on the main staircase that everyone walks past every day on their way to meet with ambassadors from those countries. Like it's really nasty.
So weird. Okay. A reminder to everyone that at any point in time, you can type your questions into the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end. Like skipping 3 other questions I had about the palace section, but I want to get to the classroom section. Of the museums I've had the delight to go to in the world, the Victoria and Albert is one of my favorites. Can you tell us a bit about the Victoria and Albert specifically, but also why that's an example of a classroom type of museum or gallery?
Yeah, so the V&A is created out of the bones of the Great Exhibition in the 1850s, which is intended to be this display of all of the industry and products of the British Empire. It's a kind of perfect trade fair of everything that's produced by Britain's colonies. And it's this huge design and manufacture exhibition. There's also art on display, but it's primarily about commercial goods. And so off the back of that, Prince Albert decides that he wants to create a museum. There's this idea that South Kensington, which is where the V&A is going to become a kind of tech center. Like it's this very, very modern idea of a sort of tech and culture and design quarter that he refers to as Albertopolis. So there's a huge amount of ego in this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so the V&A becomes the Museum of Design. Like from the beginning, it's about showing off the manufacture of Britain and its empire. And the idea is that people can go there and be inspired by what they see. And the V&A consequently is one of the first museums to have late night openings and weekend openings, even in the 19th century, because it means that people can visit after work. You know, they're early adopters of gas lights and stuff like that inside the galleries so that people can go and be inspired by what they see. And it's also the place that a lot of the East India Company museum, because obviously the East India Company have their own museum where they show off all their favorite stolen goods. A lot of that collection ends up in the V&A. So there's this huge South Asian gallery there, which has all of these pieces that are stolen by the company.
Mm. I want to talk about Banks and Cook, there's so much I want to talk about here. Obviously, to sort of make it specifically relevant to us here in Australia. On page 88 of your book, you mentioned that the National Gallery of Australia called one of Stubbs's paintings the beginning of Australia's rich visual culture, which is just the most insulting and absurd statements. Mm-hmm. But so I'm just going to show everyone these images that are reproduced in the book. Can you tell us about how you sort of, I was going to say read, but like see and understand works like these?
So these are pictures of some of the first images by Europeans of a kangaroo. And they are so fascinating to me because they're very clearly examples of people who have no idea what they're looking at, trying to understand what they're seeing. And that's the thing.
They're a bit weird.
They're really, really weird. And the kangaroo in particular, when they describe it, they say that it sort of runs like a greyhound. It's got ears like a rabbit. It sort of looks like a mouse, but it's not. It's too big for that. Like they're throwing together all of these different animals in an attempt to kind of collage what this object actually is, what this creature actually is. And the kangaroo is such a funny example of that because it's like nothing that they've seen before. And they just don't know what to do with it. I found the description. An animal of a kind nearly approaching the mus or mouse genus, about the size of a greyhound that had a head like a fawn. And it's none of those things. Like that's not an accurate description at all. but they don't know what else to do. And so they take everything that they're familiar with and they try and find an analogy. And so these images are a demonstration of someone trying to understand what they're looking at. The Stubbs painting of the kangaroo, it's so bizarre to me that that's described as the beginning of Australian art, because it was never in Australia. It was made in Britain by a British artist who had never seen a live kangaroo, who was working from these descriptions of a greyhound crossed with a mouse and a skin that he had been given by Captain Cook and Joseph Banks, that he then like inflates like a balloon. So he can sort of see the shape of this animal. But that's why that the kangaroo that he paints is so spherical, is that it's full of air. And he's trying to imagine what this animal would have been. And so he paints it and it becomes the iconic image. Like, it's what everyone else references for the next 50, 100 years when they paint a kangaroo. That pose with the sort of arms in one direction and the little coy head turn is what is is what everyone does. Like, there are artists who are then in like the First Fleet and the Second and Third Fleet who are kind of trying to represent kangaroos. And even though they've seen these live animals, they still pose them like the Stubbs kangaroo with the coy little look over the shoulder.
So fascinating how
It's just wild.
it just really struck me when I was looking at that image and reading what you wrote about it, how like all you need is one initial either deliberate or willful or negligent misinterpretation presented by a person with enough influence, and
Completely.
it just proliferates, and it's just like affects everything that comes after it. It even affects people who don't realize that they're being influenced by it continuing. On this topic, you give the example of the portrait of Omai as one example of this trope of the noble savage. But I also was hoping you could explain to anyone who's never heard this term, like noble savage, before, what that trope means. But also I'd love to hear you speak about how people applied that to when Europeans arrived and encountered Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians.
Yeah. So the idea of the noble savage is one that really begins in sort of French literature in the 18th century. It's this idea of someone who is not European and therefore is kind of different, somehow sort of closer to nature, kind of less civilized, less refined, but has the ability to gain that civilization and refinement. So, I mean, the best example of this, the kind of clearest way in, is to think about the representation of someone like Pocahontas, right? Who is a Indigenous North American woman who becomes kind of civilized, quote unquote. She takes a European name, she is christened, she comes to Europe, she dies in Britain. And she is someone who represents the idea of the noble savage because she has the ability to take on the kind of trappings of European culture. And she's willing to do that. Mai is an example of the noble savage because he willingly comes to Britain and he's able to kind of perform a particular sort of role and identity for the British people who are looking at him and controlling him. They believe that he is able to be civilized because he is willing to learn English. He's willing to learn about British society. He wears European style clothing. And so they see this figure of the noble savage as someone who can go between groups, that they can be the sort of child of nature, they can connect to their actual community, but they can also act as sort of diplomats who are able to assimilate into British culture as well. And so these people, like Pocahontas is an amazing example of it, but Mai as well, act as translators and go-betweens between the colonizing power, the Europeans, and the subjugated peoples and their communities of origin, if that makes sense. It's a kind of, it's a really knotty topic, and it's important that when we talk about the idea of a noble savage, like, to be very clear that I'm using the historical term, like this is how they are described by their contemporaries. This is
always, when said, it appears in inverted commas.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We reach a point, so just skipping 5 more questions because I realize we only have 10 minutes. I want to talk about the turning point in the book.
Yeah.
So at about halfway through pages 162 and 163, you write, we are now at a turning point in the book. So far, we have seen historic objects and discussed their presentation in collections. But from here on, we're going to focus on the ways that contemporary artists have reframed and reinterpreted these stories. The exhibition discussed in chapter 14 has become something of an archetype for these approaches. Can you tell us what that exhibition is and about, I guess, the significance of this shift in the book?
So the exhibition is a show called Mining the Museum that was put on at the Maryland Historical Society in 1993. So firstly, I want to point out this exhibition is older than I am, but it's still the kind of standard format for artist intervenes in a museum. And it's telling to me that, you know, in 28 odd years, nothing has changed in terms of how artists are permitted to approach these collections. Mm-hmm. Mining the Museum is an intervention by an African-American artist called Fred Wilson, who was permitted access to the archives of the Maryland Historical Society and was allowed to move the objects on display around. And so he does these very influential things like take the silverware cabinet, which includes these kind of beautiful examples of metalwork that are produced in Boston, and puts a set of slave shackles in the same cabinet as them to create this juxtaposition between the violence that sort of creates the wealth that the museum puts on show. And so it's about showing the kind of histories of exclusion, what's not on display, what's not included, what's not represented, that sort of thing. And this is what contemporary artists are still often doing. You know, we have this kind of genre where the artist is allowed to come into the museum and do their little intervention and have their kind of fun and spicy modern take on the past, and then it goes away again and it disappears. There is no trace left of Mining the Museum, except for the fact that every art history student since has cited it in their first year essay about museums and interventions. And this is what that Daniel Boyd project at the Natural History Museum was doing as well. You know, it's a modern artist who's allowed to come in and have a take on the past, and then it goes away again. So I wanted to split the book in this way because I think it's important to have the sort of historical context, but I'm most interested in what people are doing with that information and how artists are kind of using that history to inform their own work, to challenge it, to kind of guide us through reconsidering these past collections and events. So yeah, Mining the Museum is an incredible show, but we sort of haven't moved past that model yet.
For everyone watching, I have 2 more questions, only time, unfortunately, for 2 more questions for Alice. So please keep typing your questions for her into the Q&A box. This book came out at an incredible time. Museums, yes, being interrogated, but in particular, as we mentioned at the beginning of this chat, statues. And something you told me just before we went live was that there was one specific example or a couple of how the book was already kind of out of date because of what had happened in 2020 with Black Lives Matter. Can you talk about that particular example in that statue, and also, I suppose, what it's been like to see these ideas hit the mainstream?
Yeah, I think that thing about hitting the mainstream is really important. Like, that's why the art history degree that I did has changed. You know, there's a very different kind of public conversation about museums and colonial history happening now that is way overdue and super important. But it should have started a long time ago. And in many cases, it did start a long time ago. Museums have been doing this for a very long time, but it's finally getting the kind of press attention that it needs. The statue example is the Colston Memorial in Bristol. There's a reference in the book to the way that the Colston statue has been challenged by unofficial interventions. And within 3 months of the book coming out, that statue had been pulled down and was dumped in a river. So like, that's the highest possible level of unofficial intervention that you can get. And was a really beautiful example of how change only happens when the demand reaches a point that can no longer be sort of ignored and dismissed. I think I've been very lucky in the sense that I've sort of hit this zeitgeist. Like I cannot take any credit for it, but it does mean that the work that I've been doing with the tours and with the book has had a receptive audience, because the press coverage of statues and confronting memorials is like huge right now. And it means that there's an audience that's willing to think about this and willing to hear about it. Colston's gone. There's a question of what will take his place, and if anything will take his place. The Bristol Museum have fished him out of the river and are cleaning him up so that they can put him on display in one of the galleries. That is interesting to me, because
they should have left him dirty.
Well, so this is the thing. They're making sure that he's kind of conservation safe, but they're leaving all the paint on him. They're leaving all the kind of like damage, quote unquote, on him. Yeah. And that means that the story that's told in the gallery will be about the protest. You know, it won't just be about Colston. It'll be about the political pressure and movement and popular effort that it took to get him in the river in the first place, which is fantastic and completely changes the way that his story has been told in Bristol up until this point. This is exciting. Like, this is changing. And honestly, it's the most exciting thing for me to be out of date. Like, I want half of these objects to no longer be on display or no longer be on the museum, in the museums which they're in right now. Like, I want that to change. And so, yeah, with the tours, with the book, my goal has always been to sort of push that public conversation, but with the intention of making myself obsolete. Like, I don't want to be doing this anymore. I want museums to be better. I don't want them to need some mouthy outsider to come and yell at them anymore. I want them to do their jobs.
You gave this is my final question for you, I think. You gave an example relatively early on in the book about a person who came, I don't know if it was one of your tours or if they were listening to a talk you were giving, who basically took offense because they were a descendant of like some of the people whose actions you were critiquing. Can you tell us about that instance, like what that negative response was? And then what I really want to ask you is, like, how do we counter, what do we say in reply to the defensiveness of the establishment?
So firstly, there's a limit to what I'm actually allowed to say about that encounter. Okay. It was an instance in which someone attempted to defend the actions of their ancestors and got quite angry with me because I was critiquing the people that they were descended from. I had to take a lot of that out of the book for legal reasons, because people are very sensitive about this. And to me, it's a very clear example of the way that people are easily panicked by the idea that the things that they learned, the things that they take for granted, are not necessarily true. I think the reason I called the tours uncomfortable was about this idea that, you know, institutions are exclusionary. Not everyone feels at home in them. Not everyone is welcomed by them. And as part of that process, if you do feel welcomed in those institutions, you need to sit with that discomfort. You need to sit with the fact that the history you learned, the things that you took for granted, are not necessarily accurate or true or appropriate, like, narratives. I very deliberately sort of start and end the tours with Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria, because they are two of the kind of big name figures that you get in the school curriculum in this country. They are people that everyone sort of assumes they know all about. And what I do is then talk about the way that these two people were involved in the history of colonialism in a way that is absolutely not touched on in schools here, in order to show people, like, how much is missing from these stories, how much is up for debate, up for discussion. And so I think the most important thing that you can do is, if you have the energy, if you have the time and the willingness, try and like hold people's hand through that process. There's obviously a huge difference between what I do with the tours and this example, but I find something very kind of comforting and interesting in reading about people who do sort of de-radicalization work with people on the far right in politics. I've been reading a lot recently about people who work with, you know, former neo-Nazis to help them kind of change their mind and like de-radicalize them in that sort of context. And I think it's a really interesting space to think with, this idea that actually we have the ability, if you have the ability to talk people through that history, provide them with resources, provide them with information, you can sometimes help kind of de-escalate that process. With history, it's very different. It's about showing people that the stories they take for granted are not necessarily true. It's about helping people understand the way that politics and kind of nationalism and national identity shape the stories that we tell, they shape the museums that we visit, that sort of thing. And I think the most important thing that I'm trying to do with my work is help people recognize that these spaces are constructed, like de-center the idea that the museum knows everything and show that these are institutions that transform over time, show the kind of biases and political messiness of these institutions, to help people recognize that you can't take everything for granted in them. You can't sort of approach them uncritically. And I think helping people understand that, helping people understand art history, read the labels in a more critical way, think about these things in a more critical way, helps with engaging with contemporary politics too. You know, it's about learning to read through the kind of propaganda of a painting like the East offering its riches to Britannia. If you can see that and see how it's constructed and why it's constructed, I do honestly believe that that helps you engage with modern politics in a more critical, more nuanced way.
Something I think about all the time is how many people I see complain about fake news, who are the same people who are not willing to confront how created like history and national identity are, as though fake news is a new thing instead of something that is just like has always been happening by whoever can get away with telling
it's all the same. It's all the same. It's all connected. And that's why, like, I think art history, and I hope I'm not just saying this to sort of like blow my own trumpet as an art historian, but I think studying art history and understanding the way that images and objects are created to tell stories does
it's media literacy.
Exactly. And it's media literacy. There's also like a fundamental lack of sort of critical thinking skills being taught, I think in the UK, in the schools at least. I feel like there's a kind of parallel experience in Australia where you don't necessarily get the training and the education that you need to be able to see through these things and engage with them critically.
Okay, I've hogged you. I'm just going to go through some of the questions from the audience now. We have some really good ones. Thank you very much. A first really good one we're going to start with from Anonymous. What category of the 4 categories does the State Library of New South Wales fall into?
I think most libraries, most archives tend to fall into the classroom because of this idea that these objects are somehow improving. Somewhere like the State Library, where you've got this sort of narrative of accumulate the objects for the public good is something that I think has a very strong parallel with the classroom, the idea that these objects should be available and accessible. Somewhere like the State Library, it's been a while since I've been, but from memory has a strong tendency towards sort of didactic exhibitions where it's like, here are the things, let us tell you why they're important, which is one of the hallmarks of a classroom museum. So I would say the State Library very much falls into the classroom. Art Gallery of New South Wales does as well. Most of the sort of national state level institutions in the UK and Australia, anything with a state in the title tends to fall into the classroom, because of the idea of creating these collections that somehow improve the people, right? It's this idea of a museum or a gallery as a public service. And that's the category that libraries are a part of as well.
And that is like in an ongoing sense connected to how they justify public funding, is because they are educating the public and providing a service to the public.
Completely. Yeah, it's one of the quickest ways of figuring out how these institutions sort of categorize is to look at who founds them. Is it a private collection, private donor kind of thing? Or do they get sort of state funding? And generally speaking, even if something begins as a palace, when it's at the point of sort of arguing for sort of state significance, that's when it transitions into a kind of classroom space.
Okay, here's a really good question from Nikita. The legacies of British slavery debate is developing in Australia, in spite of what our Prime Minister might say. I'm not sure if you saw, but Morrison last year said that there was no slavery in Australia. So anyway, yes. Nikita says, I'm curious about how Britain, a nation with so much infrastructure built on the money which abolished slavery, is dealing with this.
So the quick answer is that it's not. The information is there, but as a nation, Britain is still really not engaging with this in a very meaningful way. In the last year, honestly, in the last 3 months, I can think of half a dozen institutions in the UK alone that have suddenly put out a call for a researcher to look at how slavery is established and sort of connected to their history. So the Bank of England, for example, is currently advertising for a freelance researcher to tell them about how slavery is connected to the institution.
Of the Bank of England.
The Bank of England, yeah. A bunch of other places are doing this at the moment. And I say this as someone who does this work. I've been applying for these jobs because that's what the interest is right now. But a number of institutions here are undertaking that kind of commissioned research. I imagine that in the next year or two, you will see that starting to happen in Australia as well. It's something that's been happening in the States already. Generally, when it comes to confronting the histories of slavery, it happens in the US first, then it comes to Britain, and then I think we'll see it starting to happen in Australia as well. But universities have been commissioning this research, that sort of thing as well. A lot of this is informed by the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, which is a searchable resource that shows everyone who received compensation when slavery was abolished. So this is something that not everyone knows, but when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, the government made a payout to all of the former slave owners to compensate them for the loss of their property. This was a condition of abolition. None of the formerly enslaved people received any kind of compensation, but anyone who owned a slave or was connected to slave ownership in some way received a financial payout. The debt that the government took on to make this payout was so large that it wasn't paid off until 2015. So if you paid tax in the UK before 2015, a portion of that went to compensating the descendants of former slave owners. This is the context in which all of this research is being conducted. I know that the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database was used recently in some research looking at the connection between that payout and someone who then went on to settle in South Australia, for example. So there's a financial connection there too, in terms of who takes that money and what they do with it. But yeah, the quick answer is that institutions in the UK are sort of scrabbling to create a statement or a document explaining their historic connections to slavery. And that's still very much an ongoing process. It's research-led at the moment, and we'll see what the application of that is in the next year or so.
It's interesting what you said about the US often going first. In the research from my next book, I found that a bunch of universities in America had done quite incredible jobs with looking quite clearly at how they were built on slavery. And it was the University of Virginia, even only a few years ago, uncovered another mass grave, basically with just dozens of unmarked graves of bodies of people who had obviously been owned by the university to serve the university's interests.
And in the States, a lot of the universities there were built with enslaved labor. Britain doesn't tend to have that connection because there were very few enslaved people on British soil. And so it's a slightly different, because it's financial rather than sort of physical labor in the British case, which is, I think, quite similar to what you'll see emerging with Australia, although obviously there's also the history of blackbirding, which is part of this too.
And pearling, yeah. Okay, we've got 1 minute left. No, it's fine. I do just want to mention, which we should have already, that your fantastic book is available for purchase through the State Library's bookstore. And I think a paperback, as you mentioned, is coming out soon. 2 quick questions, which I think, the first one, I'm going to ask them both. And if anyone has to leave, they can, but I think they're really great questions. So we'll go a couple of minutes over time. The first from Alexandra. How do we as patrons reconcile the colonial legacies of the institutions that we may frequent while often directly paying the same institutions to attend and appreciate their art?
So in terms of
Great question, Alexandra.
Yeah, remember that you as a visitor have a stake in these institutions. You know, you're paying to visit these collections, you're paying to sort of see them, you are as an audience member invested in that, and that also gives you a certain amount of power. I'm not saying that you should go and hassle the visitor assistants, because most of the time they'll be volunteers, and if they're not volunteers, they're way underpaid, but there is a way that you can ask these questions. You know, you can take your critical thoughts and you can have that conversation with someone who works in the gallery if you have access to that. Otherwise, talk to the people around you. Like, as a visitor, you have this ability to engage with the collection, and you can sort of do your own critical work in that space. It's really hard because these institutions are often invested in maintaining a closed facade that it's very hard to break into. But when you do have any kind of access, you have that opportunity, you should take advantage of it. So ask visitor assistance if you can, and it will eventually get back to someone with power.
Something somebody once told me too in the Australia, I know it's relevant to the Australian context, is for publicly funded organizations, they have to read and register if you fill out one of their feedback or inquiry forms. And so it seems like a kind of yelling into the void exercise, but it could potentially give somebody who wants to make a difference, who's working in that institution, more ammunition to take to sort of give evidence to. You go in and you say, oh, I came here for the Streeton exhibition, but I realized that it's like really crappy how it ignores like these perspectives, or where's all the Indigenous art, or whatever. If you put that on an inquiry or complaints form, they have to register it. So like at least
take advantage of that kind of thing. I would also say, and I'm not encouraging you to bully museums on the internet, but the most significant examples of change I've seen recently have come from Twitter. And if you see a bad label and you take a photo of it and you tweet about it, like, there's a decent chance that something will happen.
Yes.
Social media is a tool. Use it for good.
Good. Okay, this is a really wonderful question, and we will use it to round out the evening. It's from Jill. How do you envisage museums of the future, and how do we get there?
This is so hard. Oh my God, I need a full hour on this alone. I want museums to be more honest and be more transparent in terms of how the objects come into those collections. I want them to talk about their history. I think museums should be more self-reflective. You know, there needs to be a bit of navel gazing going on at these institutions. They need to spend more time understanding and explaining how they came into being, because visitors care about this. People are interested. And so I think it's necessary to have a sort of, this is who we are, this is how we came into being at the start of most of these institutions, so that you can kind of use that to frame everything that you see going forward. I would like to see, fundamentally, the most important thing is restitution of objects, repatriation of contested items, and a reframing of the financial histories of these institutions, the individuals that are involved in their foundation. Like, that kind of biography of the museum is really, really important. And I think it's the first step towards a more kind of empathetic museum industry. And as part of that as well, I think institutions need to be very seriously considering who their audiences are and who they want to serve. Like, so much of the debate in the UK right now is this idea that if you talk too much about colonial history, you'll lose your existing audience. And all that says to me is that you think your existing audience are racist. And is that who you want to serve? Like, is that who you want to appeal to? Have you considered that maybe you could do something different and be better? I just want museums to take a long, hard look at themselves. And I really hoped that with the current COVID shutdown and stuff, museums would be using this opportunity to reconsider and reframe. As far as I'm aware, that hasn't been the case. But I hope that that's what we're starting to see, and we're starting to see sort of more of that.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, there's one more that's come through. Sometimes they're just Oh yeah, it was Nikita saying thank you, wonderful discussion, and a few other people just saying thank yous and how much they got from the talk. Good. For everyone watching, a friendly reminder, the next B-List book club is with the incredible Lec Blaine. This is an amazing book. It's called Car Crash. It's going to be on a Wednesday night, which is unusual for us, the final Wednesday of this month. If you want to come in person, there are tickets still available in Sydney, and they cost a little bit of money, but you get wine and cheese. And if you want to attend for free, you can Zoom in online. We're doing it both ways from now on. But just for this evening, Alice, it has been an absolute delight to speak to you. I love your book so much. I'm so thrilled that that it's hit the mainstream. And for everyone watching at home, if you haven't already got it, go get it. It was wonderful. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thanks for all your questions.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good morning.